Nietzsche said that philosophers do not seek the truth. Instead, they justify their own version of the truth with their philosophy. What if I told you that it's not just philosophers that do this? Everyone does. You've heard the statement, facts don't care about your feelings. I know that you've seen at least one Ben Shapiro video where he says that exact statement. But that statement is entirely wrong. Of course, we need certain facts to make the right decisions, and feelings can distort that. But we need to understand how exactly that happens. I want us to think about why it is that sometimes feelings seem to override the facts of a situation, and why it is that sometimes people seem to not even have access to the same facts. If we understand this, we can address these arguments much, much better. So, to understand this, in this video, we're going to talk about Nietzsche. We're going to talk about the ideologies of the 21st century. And we're going to talk about how psychology can help us to understand philosophy. Buckle up, brother. This is going to be a wild ride. That Nietzsche quote I mentioned earlier is worth saying in its entirety because it's quite beautiful and it's quite deep. It's from Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche says, quote, "Anyone who considers the basic drives of man will find that all of them have done philosophy at some time, and that every one of them would like only too well to represent just itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and the legitimate master of all other drives. For every drive wants to be master, and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit." End quote. Nietzsche thought of philosophies as being representations of worldviews. And of course, every philosopher seemed to believe at one point or another that their worldview was the worldview. This was especially evident during the 20th century with supposedly rational ideologies like communism, scientism, or even modern liberalism. The central claim of these ideologies is that they were strictly unemotional, they were rational, and they were scientific. They used a claim of rationality to justify themselves, but as we'll see, this supposed rationality was really not rational at all. If you're wondering how this relates to facts and feelings, that is what we're going to get to next. To understand how political ideologies are affected by your feelings, we need to talk about just some very basic neuroscience. So consciousness is defined by your goals. So right now, you're watching me talk on a screen, and probably your goal is something like learn about philosophy, learn about psychology, maybe even learn a little bit about politics. If by the end of this video, it turns out that you've liked it, then you're probably going to end up liking, commenting, and subscribing, of course, right? But also, you're going to experience positive emotion from that. You're going to experience satisfaction. Now, if you so happen to not like this video, you'll experience negative emotion. You might even experience a little bit of anger if you don't like this video. This same process of consciousness and emotion being created from the goal that you have, it replicates all across your entire life. So things like your personality and your politics ultimately end up defining your goals, and they are kind of there in the beginning as a sort of judgment that's already made about what to do within reality. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant actually touches on this in his Critique of Pure Reason. He basically says that your experience of the world is tainted by the fact that you have a kind of judgment already made of the world by things like your personality or even your politics. Let's say you're a very hard worker, so you're very industrious, right? So you're going to be a person who works very hard, and it's not even going to be really within your worldview to not work hard. So whenever you see someone on welfare, you're going to be like, oh, well, maybe they should have just worked a little bit harder so that they would have never had to accept that welfare in the first place. So to you, your consciousness, your view of the world is based on that personality trait of being industrious and hardworking. This same process applies to all of your goals and how your emotions essentially align your worldview, your perception. And another really key aspect to this is the fact that your personality sets up your goals. So that implies that you're not going to see certain facts. So, because if your worldview is such a way that you only go in certain places, which obviously everyone's worldview essentially restricts them to going to certain places. That means that you're not going to go to other places and you're not going to see a worldview. Using this video as an example, if you are not interested in philosophy, you would have never even clicked on this video to begin with. Another concrete example of this is a federal bureaucrat. His whole life is dedicated to getting to DC to become a federal bureaucrat. Now, let's say he regulates farms, right? Now, his entire worldview is dedicated to getting to DC to be a bureaucrat, not in getting to a farm to become a farmer. So they never even really become truly aware of the facts of farm life. They'll never even see those facts at all. Keep that in mind because it's really important going on to the next section. What all of this means is that the facts of the world that you see are defined by your worldview, and the facts that you don't see, you just never see them. And if they do come into your worldview, they actually create negative emotion because oftentimes they contradict your current worldview. And obviously, this shows up heavily in political ideology. If you want sources on all of that stuff that I just said, by the way, read The Emotional Brain, Maps of Meaning, and Emotion and Adaptation. Those are the best books on the topic of how emotion sets up your perception. A very specific example of how rationalizations cover up your worldview is this idea in finance and economics known as rational actor theory. This idea underlied most of modern economics and finance, at least until behavioral economics came in and demolished this idea. People who subscribed to rational actor theory actually unironically believed that people made quote-unquote rational decisions and they weighed the pros and cons of every individual act before doing it. And they also assumed that these choices wouldn't change over time just to make the math of it easier to calculate. And how exactly did they come to this conclusion? I am not kidding. A bunch of mathematicians got together and essentially just made up these equations that they never actually empirically tested in the real world, and they just used the math to say, yeah, everyone's rational. As a part of their theory, they actually assumed that people have access to perfect information, and again, that the choices that they make don't really change over time. And they never tested it. They actually never tested this. You can actually Google this and look this up. It is totally insane. So in their head, you go to Walmart and you have $20, and since you're this super rational person, obviously you're just going to buy chicken and rice so that you can last for the week on $20, and you're definitely not going to go get a steak and grab a Monster and walk out, right? Obviously. As ridiculous as this logic sounds, the same kind of logic was essentially used to support many of the ideologies of the 20th century. They were not tested, they were simply implemented, and then the moral justifications came later. And believe it or not, it actually explains why you often can't have a good conversation with a liberal family member over the dinner table. Let's think about it this way. So both with modern liberalism and communism, the values underlying it are supposedly equality and compassion, right? So as a result of this ideology, of this desire for equality and compassion, we saw massive welfare programs, massive government spending, and attempts to redistribute other people's money, again, to the less fortunate classes. All of this was done in the attempt to make people equal. And a lot of this came because in the social sciences, they had this idea known as blank slate theory, which is essentially that everyone is born equal. And that if there are some type of inequities as people become older, clearly it's not because of how they were born, it's because of something that society did to them. So, of course, people, if they're born a blank slate, can be socially engineered to then become something else. Now, this blank slate theory has actually been pretty thoroughly demolished in the social sciences. However, it still underlies much of the feeling of modern liberalism, the values of modern liberalism, and the policies that they implement. Now, the average person doesn't really know about blank slate theory, of course, but that type of idea, that type of ideology still infects their thinking, and it still sets up the emotional landscape for how they interact with the world. Let me tell you a little story that will illustrate this. Think about this. Have you ever tried to bring up crime statistics with someone who is obsessed with equity? Probably didn't go well. I actually did this once when I was working at a restaurant, and we were having a conversation about crime, and I was like, oh, it would be really nice if all neighborhoods had low crime. So, of course, I want minority neighborhoods to enjoy low crime like I enjoy in my neighborhood or my parents' neighborhood. That would be great. Now, the girl I was talking to did not believe the crime statistics that I brought up to her. They were FBI crime statistics, and I was like, why? Like, I don't understand why you don't believe these. And she said, oh, well, obviously they're made up to oppress minorities. And I was like, okay, so maybe they are, but what if they aren't? And she was like, oh, even if they aren't, it's just that, obviously they're oppressed, so they have to act out in these ways. And this went on for a little while to where it seemed like no matter what I said, there was no way that she would admit that her worldview had any fault in it whatsoever. I was completely shocked, but I learned something that day. People will reject statistics and facts that do not accommodate their worldview, and they most likely have never even seen them before, and thus they will cause emotional reactions within those people. Now, this isn't a politics channel, but the point is that if modern liberalism was scientific and rational, wouldn't it be able to incorporate these things without having such a major emotional reaction whenever they were brought up? Of course, it could if it was rational, but liberalism and communism, they aren't rational. It's all just a bunch of words in a row to explain their feelings. People are going to get emotional whenever you show them facts that they haven't seen before because it disrupts their current action and even their current perception. They either have to reject it so that they can just keep doing what they're doing, or they have to incorporate it, which if they incorporate the fact into their worldview, it's actually worse because then they have to change things, and people hate changing things. And remember, in most people's worldviews, they are the good guy. Facts that draw the most violent emotional reactions are facts that challenge this idea or would require them to change substantially in some way. When you keep this in mind, it's very obvious why some political worldviews have to use violence or censorship in order to get their point across.